Today marks a huge day for the state of Washington and for people who have watched one political party erode our quality of life, erode our sense of safety for far too long. 3 Let's Go Washington initiatives that were signed each by more than 400,000 voters of this state are law today. They became law at midnight, and some of them, I think, will have a substantial impact on our day-to-day lives. First and foremost, the police pursuit initiative. Back in 2021, when there was this race and social justice awakening, there was a successful effort in Olympia to erode the ability of police to keep us safe, to make it nearly impossible for police to pursue criminals. And we've seen the results of that, the lack of law and order on our streets. As Thurston County Sheriff Derek Sanders put it, the days of running because the law says you can are over. If you're thinking about fleeing here, make sure the unit behind you doesn't say sheriff on the side of that. I love that. He says deputies will be authorized to pursue for any violation of law and will no longer need supervisory permission to conduct pit maneuvers at any speed so long as considerations are made for the risk to the public and the Graham v. Connor use of force factors are satisfied. Deputies will be encouraged to pit early and often to comply with state law, which requires the pursuit to be ended as soon as practically possible. That from Thurston County Sheriff Derek Sanders. I love that. The days of running because the law says you can are over. And that really has been what this is. You know, there has been this real denial, I think, from Democrats who supported this no police pursuit policy to acknowledge that criminals knew about it. You know, they were calling 911 saying, hey, don't pursue me. This is an unlawful pursuit. That it emboldened criminals, that it hurt the law abiding, and that allowing people to flee from traffic stops wasn't just about, oh, this is like teens on a joyride, which Democrats would have you believe. No, these were stolen vehicles that would be used to commit other crimes, sometimes violent crimes. And I think, you know, in this whole debate, it's been painted as this black and white issue. You know, Democrats said they did this because police pursuits are dangerous. Police pursuits are dangerous. No one who supported restoring reasonable police pursuits has ever said, you will not be able to find me one example of them saying that police pursuits are safe. No, police pursuits can be dangerous, but they're necessary in order to maintain law and order. They're necessary in order to maintain the rule of law. And so they will continue in jurisdictions that allow this initiative to, you know, go back on some of the policies that were put in place in 2021. Now, there are jurisdictions who will absolutely stick to the pursuit policy as it has been for a couple years. Seattle, Bellevue, for instance. So there are a couple agencies who there's no difference today from yesterday. However, there are some agencies who say, let's go. Hands off our law enforcement officers so they can enforce the law. One of those agencies is Pierce County. We spoke earlier this morning with Sergeant Darren Moss of the Pierce County Sheriff's Office, who explained to us what the difference is there between yesterday and today, now that that initiative is law. Sergeant Darren Moss, welcome to Undivided.
Thank you for having me on, Brandi.
Are you as relieved today as I am?
Yes. We put our new policy in place at midnight last night, and we already had 3 pursuits last night, and we had another car take off from us this morning, and the deputy decided not to pursue. But yeah, our deputies are ready. They've been waiting for this. I'm sure not just us, but our community is very thankful as well.
Yeah. How long do you think it'll take before the criminals start to realize, like, oh, we can't just flee anymore?
It's going to be a transitional period. The big thing is going to be how many of these guys do we catch and how many of them are going to get time, because that's going to be the trigger that goes, okay, it really wasn't worth it because now I got a year instead of I thought I would just get off with it. Pulling over, you still might get time, but you're not going to get any time for the eluding, which is another felony on your record. So I'd give it maybe a year for some of these guys to catch up. You know, when you give them an ollie oxen free, it only takes 2 weeks for them to get used to that. But when we tell them to start behaving again, some of them just going to have to learn the hard way.
Yeah. And I get the sense sometimes that a lot of these pursuits or vehicles, you know, stolen vehicles that flee are the same people sometimes. Have you seen that, especially with, you know, youth?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And one of the tragic things I'd say from this perspective is, or from this experiment, is that it was in order to lower the number of pursuits, but we saw a dramatic rise in violent crime, uh, the burglaries, stolen vehicles. We also saw a rise in crime being committed by juveniles. And it's not just like they're stealing stuff or stealing cars. They were doing burglaries with those cars, breaking into businesses. And then on top of that, the courts stopped, putting them in jail and letting them go home. But what happened with that? You just continue to not discipline, and all those juveniles started get arresting for shootings and stabbings and homicides. So eventually, those crime stats started going down on the stolen vehicles because they were committing the majority of all these crimes. We have one kid from another jurisdiction. We got bulletins on him. He was responsible for at least 21 that they could prove.
Wow.
21 stolen vehicles. He's been arrested now. That's going to cut our numbers way, way down. But that kid's life has now been ultimately ruined because he's got all these charges that we let pent up because he wasn't being held responsible. That's one of the hardest things for me, seeing our youth being affected negatively. If you put somebody in a home with no discipline and they have bad behavior, well, you shouldn't have put them in a home when there was no discipline.
Yeah, and I know you work for a sheriff that lets you speak freely, so speak as freely as you're willing to speak on this. One of my key frustrations throughout all of this, and you called it an experiment, and I think that's a very apt term. One of my frustrations has been, you alluded to it, the lack of willingness to acknowledge the implications of letting people flee from law enforcement. There was this hyper focus on the very rare instances where a pursuit ends in a loss of life. But they would never acknowledge what people were fleeing to do, what they were using stolen cars to go do. You talked about some of the really serious crimes that result from that. So can you just articulate that a little bit from a law enforcement perspective? How frustrating it was to have politicians just deny the reality of what this experiment did.
Yeah, I would always comment and say, there's both good and bad consequences. If the goal is to lower law enforcement pursuits, it was a great success. You lowered law enforcement's pursuits, but you have to take accountability for all the negative consequences that go with it. And as a legislator or as the public, we have to decide what the weight and balances of everything adds up to be, and if we like it or we don't like it. Obviously, the public didn't like it. They all signed this petition to roll back some of those changes. One of the things that you can easily see in my entire career, I worked in San Diego Police Department for 3 years. I had never, ever, ever heard of a juvenile taking a stolen vehicle and running it through a GameStop or a weed shop to steal video games or a little bit of weed or alcohol from a corner store. And in the last year, we had so many in our region because there was no accountability. That is direct correlation to the laws. I had never seen that in my entire career. And all of a sudden, the juveniles start committing more crime and they start getting even worse and worse. Traffic fatalities, worst they've been ever in the state. Washington Traffic Safety Commission is the one that put out the numbers, not me. Yeah. But our numbers in Pierce County were terrible for the last 3 years, highest we've had in a long time. That's a direct correlation to the reckless driving we see, which we know started during COVID, but got extremely worse after the laws passed. It's not an opinion. This is coming straight from statistics. You can look at the auto theft numbers start to increase after the law passes. My violent crimes started going way, way up in 2022. It increased all of 2021 in just the last 4 months of the year. But I was looking at just violent crime was up like 164% for aggravated assaults for the first 3 months of 2022 after we had gone through this law change. And auto theft was up 197% January through March of 2022, right after these laws took effect. Those are the consequences we had. But if they say, well, you guys aren't doing your job, like, we were trying to do our job and now you've handed us an unwinnable situation, and it just got worse all over.
Yeah, well, the handcuffs come off, as you said, in Pierce County. They came off at midnight last night. So just quickly describe to people the difference between yesterday and today in Pierce County.
Yeah, so on the 5th, if we had a vehicle that was stolen, or if it was a burglary vehicle, a suspect in a burglary, we weren't allowed to chase because it wasn't one of the specific violent felonies or rape or sexual assault type crimes that we were allowed to pursue for. That law has been rolled back. They've got rid of specific crimes we could chase for. It's back to you can chase for any violation of the law, but you also have to make sure that it poses a threat to the safety of others. And I think that's really important that they have that in there. In the past, it could be any violation of the law we could chase, but now it really needs to pose that safety risk to other people. And I think that's great because it does give balance. It puts accountability on the department and on the officers and their supervisors, but it also gives that discretion back to the officers, the deputies, and the patrol supervisors, because ultimately we are putting our faith and trust in the people that we hire to do this job. And I 100% believe they did not trust us to do what we were paid to do, what we got hired to do, why I have to go through a polygraph and an extensive background and a lot of training so that I make sure that I know what the rules are, I'm going to abide by them, and I'm not out there to just, crash vehicles and hurt people. I'm out there trying to prevent and solve crimes. And we know if we don't have the identity of that driver, it makes it extremely hard to solve that crime. If you have a property crime that's going on over and over and over again with the same vehicle, but you're not allowed to chase them, how are we ever going to figure this thing out?
Yeah.
Now we have the ability when it's safe to do so at 2 o'clock in the morning, way out in my mountain detachment where there's only 10 houses for 18 square miles. We're going to chase that guy and we're going to figure out who he is.
And I'll tell you what, I would much rather have deputies who are trained making those decisions about what's in the best interest of public safety than a politician in a suit in a marble building in Olympia. So Sergeant Darren Moss with the Pierce County Sheriff's Office, thank you for coming on. Thank you and your department for telling the truth during this whole thing because you were one of the agencies that was like, no, we're not just going to sit back and not say anything about this. And our best to the men and women of your Sheriff's Office as they take the handcuffs off today and get to go out and do their jobs.
All right. Thank you very much.
So good for Sergeant Darren Moss. And let me say this, shame on every single politician who allowed that failed experiment to continue for as long as they did. Shame on the politicians who refused to see the truth, who stuck to outdated, inaccurate data, who kept holding up examples of a couple times where police pursuits had gone wrong, blaming the police instead of the criminals that fled in the first place, and use that as a way to justify the continued deterioration of public safety and law and order on our streets. It took Washington voters to fix this. It took more than 400,000 people signing an initiative. It took boots on the ground out there for months on end, explaining to people the importance of doing so because our elected leaders are too cowardly. We're too cowardly to admit that they were wrong. They would just as soon let people die. That's not hyperbole. They would just as soon let people die than admit that they were wrong. Those are the kind of people who are in power in Olympia. How shameful is that?